going to talk about remote code execution in your text editor. Give him a round of applause.
Hello, everyone. Am I mic'd okay? Am I projecting? Sound good? Okay, great. So hi, this is remote code execution in your text editor. And I'm Max. I used to be a professional hacker, but we called it security consultant. Then I ran a startup called App Canary, and I'm actually starting a new job on Monday, so I'm pretty excited about that. And thank you, I'm on Twitter at @Veytsman if you care. So what about you? Probably you don't know much Elixir, and I'm really happy to come after Julia's talk because reading the code is important, and the other wizard secret is you can read the code in languages that you don't know and kind of guess at what it means, and maybe you'll be right. So I'm going to show you a little Elixir code and kind of explain it, and it doesn't matter if you've never seen it before. The other thing I know about you is you probably have some source code on your computer, like maybe for a job you worked at, for some company, something that's proprietary. Maybe you have SSH keys on your computer that you can SSH into a server that has some important data on it. Maybe you have AWS keys on your computer and you can shut down servers or look into S3 buckets. I think this is a very target-rich environment for hackers in this room right now. So if you remember back in 2013, there was this NSA leak and Edward Snowden released a bunch of documents, and one of the cool caches of documents he released was this internal forum of NSA people where they wrote each other memos about all the cool stuff they could do. And my favorite forum post is called I Hunt Sysadmins. And it's just about somebody who's, the way that they attack targets is they go after sysadmins. They're like, I want to find somebody who we think is a terrorist in Egypt. I'm just going to hack into all the Egyptian telecoms, and then I will have access to everybody in Egypt, and I will do it through the sysadmins. So pretty important to think about your tools. So we're going to talk about text editors, specifically Alchemist, which is the Vim plugin for Elixir. Get it? And it does all the stuff that you expect your editor to do. It does code completion. You can look up documentation. You can jump to definition. And I was kind of looking at this, and I found this bug in their issue tracker called server executes arbitrary code for remote machines. Okay. So I was doing this in June, July. This bug is from February. And the reason that they didn't react to it too quickly is that it was listening on all interfaces. So it was listening remotely, and there was some code execution, but it was kind of hard to get support. And how could somebody attack you anyway, if you're on a Wi-Fi network? So I decided to explore this a little bit, and we'll explore it together. So we'll start with this little bit of code, and this is the main serve loop. Kind of looks like this is a little bit of Elixir, but you don't really need to know anything about the language other than we have this bit of code in the center where there's data, and you're calling some string.strip process commands. So the only bit of syntax that you need to know is this pipe operator. So we basically get this data, then we call string.strip, which is probably going to remove a new line from it. We can guess from other programming languages. Then we're going to call something called process commands on it, which is probably going to do some work. And then we're going to write it back to a socket. So I don't even know Elixir, but I can kind of guess at what this is doing. So now we're going to look at the process commands, and it looks like there's a bunch of commands. There's docl, info, eval is probably an interesting one. And then there's ping and version. And we can look at the definition of the eval command, which is going to be in the file called eval.elixir. And so again, we have this pipe operator. So it takes some arguments, it normalizes them, then it processes them, and then it responds back to you. Okay. So what does normalize do? This is the interesting part. So normalize is just going to eval a string. And you see this a lot where I have a string and I want to turn it into an object in my language, so how do I do that? Why don't I just evaluate the string as code, and then I get back a structure or a tuple or whatever in my language. So we're pretty much done here because we're reading a string off a socket and then we're evaluating it. Also, you can look further and see that when it takes that string, turns it into an object, if that object is the keyword eval and a file name, we're going to read that file. evaluate that file, and then put it back on the socket. So I'm going to show you what this means. Oh, I'm doing great for time. OK, so I'm going to run the server. So I'm running the Elixir dev server that is my editor is using in order to like do code completion and stuff like that. Every time I run it, it randomizes the port. So I'm just going to talk to that port with a tool called netcat. And netcat is really useful if you haven't seen it before. It just lets you write stuff to a TCP socket and kind of, I can type some stuff. This thing is going to say, give me a bunch of error messages because I typed random stuff. I could type val and then give it a file name. Well, that's nice. It says, error, can't read this file. There's no path AAA. OK. So what if I give it a file name that I know exists on my computer? OK. Keyword argument must be followed by a space after nobody. File, no file. So it's clearly trying to read Etsy password as Elixir code. And what it's complaining about is that Etsy password isn't valid Elixir code. OK. So what if I just create an Elixir file that does something? So let's say hello StarCon. We'll put it into hello.exs. OK. See if this works. So now I'm going to give it a path. And the file is called hello.exs. OK. So I put that output, and I put it back on the socket. So now I know that if I can talk to this thing, I can evaluate any Elixir file on your computer, which is useful, but you probably don't have like Elixir files that do bad stuff. You probably just have a bunch of code of whatever projects you're working on. But the thing about it is that it's like, we know that we can evaluate any file, but we also evaluate the string in order to turn it into this object, like this tuple that has the eval keyword and the file name. So what if we give it a string with like something else in it? So what if we do something like, will this work? And it closed the connection, but in my server, it did print ed out in that context. So now I can evaluate arbitrary code and like evaluate any file and then get the results of evaluating that file back on the socket back to me. So this is cool. And if I'm in the same Wi-Fi network as you, and this thing is listening on all interfaces, I can now maybe run some code on your computer. It's interesting. What else can I do? Well, there's this great language called JavaScript, which will evaluate code from any website. And what's cool is that this thing doesn't even have to, it can only be listening locally as long as your browser is able to talk to an arbitrary port on localhost. And I can just do that with an XML HTTP request. Like with a JavaScript AJAX request, I can just send data. And there's a way in JavaScript to just send a blob of like a payload to the port. So I'm going to do that. And what kind of payload do I want? Well, this is a little bit big. Oh, great, my pointer is here. So the first part is I'm going to do a file.write of a bunch of stuff into a file. And then I'm going to tell it to evaluate that file as Elixir code. And what I'm going to put there is like, hello, I'm an HTTP server. Here's an HTTP response. This is actually just like a carriage return new line. I just had to evaluate it as bytes and turn it back into a string, because if I send a carriage return in a new line inside of an HTTP request, it's going to stop writing at that point. So a lot of times when you're trying to send HTTP requests over HTTP, you need to like obscure the carriage return new line part, if that makes any sense. So then I'm going to read your Etsy password, and that's my server. It's a tiny little HTTP server written in Elixir that does one thing, which is send your Etsy password back as an HTTP response. Will this work? it actually won't work because when you run this in a browser, you're going to get a cross-origin resource sharing error. So browsers are good at protecting you against this sort of thing, and the way that they do it is that you're not allowed to render responses from servers that don't allow you to access them. Like, if I'm trying to do a cross-origin access, my server actually has to say, I'm allowing a request from this host, like, the browser, please render it. And that's something to protect from JavaScript doing just this. But we can just add access control allowed origin to our HTTP response in the server that we wrote, which says you can render a request from any server that you want to talk to. Let's see if this actually works. Okay, so one thing that I need to do is I need to remember the port, which is 58716. Okay, so I wrote this little website that just executes that JavaScript that I show you, and then I click hack me, and that's my Etsy password file. So the epilogue. Demos get your bugs fixed. This bug is already fixed, and it happened within a week after me putting that bit of code in their issue versus the 5 months that it took of people not really understanding the implication. A lot of times you just have to write the exploit to get people to understand what the bug really means. One thing that we didn't really talk about is, why is it that this thing let me, it had a set of known requests that it wanted, but it still let me put arbitrary Elixir code in and evaluate it. So I'll actually show you that bit of code. And it's right here, is that it knows about a comp command, a dockle command, an info command, but if it doesn't know what command it's doing, it's just going to return nil and keep iterating this loop. And there's something called Postum's law, I think, which is that you should be really conservative in what you emit and really liberal in what you accept. And sometimes that has really bad security implications. Sometimes you want to be really conservative in what you accept as well. And in this case, the first patch that I submitted was just throw an exception if you ever see input that doesn't look right. And at least it'll be harder to hack. Also, why is this thing listening on all interfaces? It should only be listening on localhost, although that still doesn't stop this JavaScript browser attack. Also, why is your editor listening on a socket? Really, your editor can just talk to this program through a pipe, or it could just write to a buffer. There's no need to actually do a TCP socket, which is great because now, when I went back to write this talk, Alchemist is currently using something called Elixir Sense instead of Alchemist Server, which is what we were looking at today. And Elixir Sense maybe doesn't have this bug. I haven't really looked at it, but I'm going to assume that it's okay. That is my talk. So thank you.